Belgium is way worse than the UK. Belgium is one of the worst places for the institutionalisation of this. This is a Green Party disease. If anybody's out there thinking that this stuff hasn't touched Belgium, it's in the water in Belgium. Belgium adopted the Yogyakarta Principles 100%.
Roisin Michaux. We've only met once, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation. Your Twitter bio states that you are a journalist, a Brussels-based journalist, if I'm not mistaken, investigating gender identity ideology. How do you end up doing what you do?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me on. I'm what's known as a Twitter TERF, I guess. I spend my days obsessed and appalled by the reality-defying new movement, also known as, there's many names for gender identity ideology, transgenderism, all kinds of things. And so I used to work as a regular journalist for kind of culture magazines and things in Belgium and abroad. And then when all of this madness descended upon us, I realized that nobody was writing about it and nobody was talking about it. There was an appetite for it, meaning there was a niche for that kind of content. So I started writing about it for some feminist magazines. There's certainly a demand for this kind of somebody to cover these issues, because I'm not sure to what extent you're familiar with the situation, but there's not much coverage of it in our mainstream press.
I think it's probably, there's not a lot of coverage because this is the, let's say, the mainstream narrative. It's sort of part of the mainstream narrative. And what I often get, I wrote the first book on wokeness in Belgium 2 years ago. And a comment I regularly been getting in the lectures I've been giving until now is, we don't really understand what you're going on about. These things are much more deranged and much more manifested, let's say, in the Anglo-Saxon world, and in Belgium it's not that bad. I think you might have a slightly different perspective because, if I'm not mistaken, you are following the European Commission, European Parliament, and all the lobbying that is going on down there. So I'm really interested. Tell me, is that a fair assessment that things are not that bad in Belgium and it's really an Anglo-Saxon thing, or what's your take?
The thing is, the Anglo-Saxon thing is, what's unique about that is the reaction to it, because I think that British culture, English culture, especially the UK, they have a very big accountability culture, which you don't really have that much in Belgium as a whole, which means that when something goes wrong or somebody's treated badly or things don't work on an official level like they're supposed to do, people call it out. And that's a really strong culture in the UK. Every culture is different. Belgium is way worse than the UK in so many ways.
Could you illustrate that with an example? Why is Belgium worse? Because we hear a lot about the cancellation of, for example, Kathleen Stock. We heard death threats against J.K. Rowling, all these things. I'm not familiar with any death threats in Belgium or people being openly and manifestly cancelled in those numbers. So I would have a hard time. I'm not saying that it is less bad in Belgium. It's just harder to find these very publicized examples.
Oh, so I see now we're talking about two different things, actually, because if you're looking for out and out like cancellations or very high profile, public disputes about this topic, no, we don't really have that. When I say that Belgium is worse, Belgium is one of the worst places for the institutionalization of this stuff. So my area of interest is this. We are constantly putting out fires, and the fires, let's take the fires in the UK, there are many, mostly because, as I said, there's a huge accountability culture. But the fires in Belgium, for example, would be the conversion therapy ban that was introduced, I think, in October 2022. So this is a conversion therapy ban which would, in effect, penalize a psychiatrist or psychologist or any kind of psychotherapist who didn't affirm the gender identity of a young person. And they even have in that law a provision that says that if the person is in a position of power over the victim, quote unquote, that's an even more aggravating factor.
Okay, I see where you're going. And that's probably because we have the Green Party, which is part of the government in Belgium. So, and that is manifesting itself in all kinds of, let's say, woke laws, which are part of law, and where Belgium is really let's say, leading in this field. For example, we are one of the first European countries which has a law on ecocide, which is lowering our status as humans to the same status as the animal world and the plant world. That is because the Green Party is very, very influential in government today in Belgium, which explains why a lot of this stuff is institutionalized at the moment. Yeah.
This is a Green Party disease. It's a Green Party virus. It really is. And I'm, I know I understand from the material you've put out before that we're probably not ideologically super aligned. Like, I'm quite a lefty. I would be, of the left, have been of the left my entire life. It's starting from when I was conscious of these things. It's a disease, and talking about the institutionalization of it, Belgium is so deep in it when you look at where it comes from, because it generally comes from these supranational in international bodies. It's not coming from the EU, it's coming from the UN. And Belgium, and so basically what the UN does is it makes these, the UN laws or treaty bodies or conventions or whatever, they're not legally binding. They're just sort of like norms that you're supposed to follow. So you can follow them to a lesser or greater degree. Belgium adopts recommendations from the UN with bells on. Like, they'll add extra stuff. I mean, there's so much to say, and I don't even know where to start. But if anybody's out there thinking that this stuff hasn't touched Belgium, it's in the water in Belgium. All of the Western countries and countries in South and Central America and the Asia Pacific countries, for about 25 years, they've been trying to get the UN countries, all the countries of the UN at the General Assembly, basically, to adopt protections for SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, into UN laws. So they lobby for this, and all the advocacy groups in New York and Geneva, they say you need to update we need to have a new resolution or a new protections for these people in law. So sexual orientation and gender identity, it's a completely other story, but they got forced married with each other by men in the 70s, 80s, 90s in the US. So that was a step before. But let's imagine we're at the finishing point where everyone's decided that sexual orientation and gender identity are the same thing, which they're not. And the evidence of that, we had a lot of fights amongst those groups in the early days saying, well, we don't see the relevance of transvestites and transsexuals in same-sex attracted advocacy. So anyway, once they eventually got forced teamed, joined together as if they were one and the same thing, the mission was on then, and it was mostly led by countries in South America and also Norway and Sweden, to get it into UN resolutions so that all countries would be on the hook. And then it makes it difficult for especially smaller countries not to implement what the UN has said about, you have to recognize gender identity as a protected characteristic. Like, who can argue with that? But once you get gender identity into law, then it's like you're saying it's a real thing, and then it sort of reproduces itself in other laws. So anyway, a bunch of people said to themselves, okay, we're never going to convince all of the conservative Islamic states and the African states to adopt these propositions that we keep coming with,
Exactly, yeah.
They're never going to do it. So what we're going to do is we will create a document called Yogyakarta Principles, and we will show how countries, having signed up to General Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are on the hook for this stuff anyway. They have to do it anyway. So it was called the Yogyakarta Principles. It was drawn up in a Muslim country in Yogyakarta in Indonesia, just to give the impression that it wasn't coming from the West, because that would have been the kiss of death, as one of the countries said about it. But most of the people who drew up those Yogyakarta Principles were actually UN special rapporteurs and things themselves. So and their dream was that would be cited by governments and legislators when they say, we need to introduce this new law that, it introduces hate speech as an aggravating factor if somebody has a different gender expression, whatever. Belgium adopted those principles wholesale into their constitutions. They took these Yogyakarta Principles like a plug and play cartridge and just stuck it into their laws and said, we have to do all of these things now. Other countries didn't do that. The UK didn't do that. They Green Party politicians, whatever, cited the Yogyakarta Principles when they were trying to introduce, for example, conversion therapy laws. Belgium adopted the Yogyakarta Principles 100%.
This is really a top-down ideology. It's not something that is coming from the bottom up. It's
No.
really something that is shoved down the throats of populations who are really, every chance they get, they vote against it. So this is really something that is shoved down the throats via all these supranational institutions, NGOs, etc., etc. One little follow-up question. You mentioned in the beginning that you consider yourself of the left and that we might not be fully aligned on, in that way. But do you understand when I say that for me that's completely irrelevant? Because for me, that dichotomy, left-right, is no longer, let's say, the main lens that is really important in this discussion.
No.
For me, this whole discussion is about humanism versus anti-humanism or post-humanism.
Yeah.
And I think we're both fully aligned on that. So for me, the fact that you're coming at this from a left-wing angle, for me, is like totally irrelevant. It doesn't hinder the conversation one bit.
That's really interesting. And I'm almost doing some PR for myself here, because I know that this will be taken to prove that I'm a Nazi, or I'm a, to even discuss with you. So I'm sort of, I shouldn't feed the beast, but sometimes I need to sort of have a little disclaimer to say, by the way, guys, I haven't ever I have been put into a box now that I have never considered myself part of. But I consider what you said is exactly right. There's no such thing as left and right anymore.
No, it's irrelevant because, as far as I can see, when I was researching for my book, which was dealing with woke in the broadest sense, the woke ideology, when you call yourself left, it means that you have this particular concern about class distinctions, and that is really what's driving your view. Whereas the woke are obsessed with identity, not with class. Class is the last of their concerns. So the woke are not of the left, in my view, not at all.
Yeah, and I don't think they've thought about class concerns for a long time, except as window dressing. So
exactly,
yeah. So it is a complicated conversation, because I'm so happy that you invited me to talk, because I talk to anyone, and I know that I'll get labeled in certain ways afterwards. But they call me a fascist anyway, and they call me a
but they do that just because they want to stop the conversation, and I think that's something that we really have to take great care to avoid. They want to shut down any type of conversation, because what they're doing is really, some people I call it anti-human, post-human. It goes against everything that makes us human. I was just watching a super interesting conversation between Paul Kingsnorth and Mary Harrington exactly on that topic, where they discuss what makes us humans. Paul Kingsnorth comes from the environmental movement and has now formally distanced himself from the green movement, which he does not see as the same thing, rightfully so, because the green movement is increasingly an anti-human, post-human movement, which objects to anything that makes our society work, namely our families, religion, the concept of the nation. Anything metaphysical has to go. And if you start doing that, then the only thing that's left is the power of money. So, and that's where they get aligned with the hyper-capitalist side, and big pharma, et cetera, who actually benefit from this stuff, who benefit from the view that we are just meat sacks and not persons, not individuals, and that we are like meat Lego blocks
this
that you can just
is very good. Yes.
Yeah, that you can just arbitrarily remove organs and chuck them in here and chuck them there, like we are not living and conscient beings. And this type of anti-human view is really fully embraced by the Greens, who have, as I said, nothing to do anymore with their main driver is not anymore the environment. Their main driver seems to be this. They seem to be fully intertwined with this. What Paul Kingsnorth called the machine, this giant technocratic technological monster that we're feeding, and that only knows the power of money.
My son is 11 years old, and he said to me the other day, I wish all of the billions of people on Earth would die so that we could save the Earth.
Well, yeah, that's a typical view. It's anti-human. Huh?
I don't focus on men in bathrooms or Leah Thomas or any of those stuff. I focus on the fact that it was decided that biological sex should be erased as a category in law. That is all I need to know. To all of the outcomes that you see is all based on the idea that somebody has decided that we should erase the categories of biological sex in law. Now, why would they want that, and why would they do that? And we can cycle through all sorts of theories, but that's all we have is hypotheses and theories. And I've gone through quite a few, and I think that this is what it is. When they saw that people in especially poorer parts of the world, they identify too closely with being mothers or being fathers or being family members. This is a problem, you know. So what they also then HIV hit, and they found out, and most straight men don't like to hear this, but a lot of men have sex with men without considering themselves gay. You know, there's a lot of men out there who are, paying transsexuals for sex in red light districts in cities all over the world, and they're spreading HIV to their wives, and their wives are spreading it to their babies, and this was a huge issue. So it all sort of accumulated in the conclusion that there are all, people pretend you're mother, father, straight, and that's it. There are all sorts of identities. This is what the academics brought. There's all sort of identities. There's all sort of ways of expressing sexuality. There's all sorts of nobody is either straight or gay. This is a Kinsey thing. Nobody's straight or gay. Everyone's on a spectrum. This is Alfred Kinsey sexology bullshit. Judith Butler, all of these academics, no, there's no such thing as sex. All there is gender identity. So we need to break the bonds between how you identify and your biological sex. And this is what's going on. Ireland was one of the earliest adopters of gender self-ID. It was Argentina, Malta, Ireland, Belgium. That was the order. Those were the first 4 countries. And by the way, Argentina is no coincidence. It's because it has a huge problem with HIV among transsexual sex workers and the straight men who were paying them for sex and then causing the spread of HIV. So there's maybe too many things at once, but let me just say this. When Ireland was going to pass self-ID, they included in the legislation that you had to have some psychiatric test or whatever. And it wasn't good enough for the trans activists. And the man who was responsible for leading the drafting of the Yogyakarta Principles that I mentioned in the beginning, he wrote an op-ed in the Irish Times, the biggest circulation paper in Ireland, saying you absolutely cannot require somebody to go through any steps in order to change their gender, because people's gender changes from day to day. It fluctuates. Now, that was published in 2014 or something in the most, influential paper in the country, and nobody raised any red flags. Nobody asked why. Why would you need to change your gender on a regular basis? And this is the result of it. So as I said, all of the disgraces of men and women's sports, all of the things that we're seeing right now, it's not about some men feel like they're born in the wrong body. It's not about that. It's about erasing the category in law, because these people believe that it fluctuates, and that is based on bullshit academics, the HIV crisis that showed that there are all sorts of people having sex with all sorts of people. And let me just say also, boys are having sex with each other in the most conservative countries. Boys are all having sex with each other. This is the fundamental idea. Decouple sex from reproduction. It's like Brave New World. Everybody should be able to have all the time, as long as they're not getting pregnant and they're not on drugs. We should encourage it. And there was a thing went around on Twitter the other day that was a sign from Planned Parenthood, and it said virginity is a social construct. And I shared it with some women, and we were all just saying, what the fuck is this? But I have to play devil's advocate and say, I see where they're going with that. So if one of the very harmful gender social norms in the poorest parts of the world is that young women are pure and young men are promiscuous, and to be, to play by the rules in lots of countries, young men have to be sleeping around with women from a very young age. Now, this is causing problems because they're getting women pregnant, but they're also picking up diseases, and it's causing destructive attitudes towards women and stuff. And the other one, as I said, is women are supposed to be innocent, girls are supposed to be innocent. So this is the kind of thing that organizations like International Planned Parenthood and the United Nations Fund for Population Activities and the United Nations Development Plan, this is what they're trying to fight against, because they're trying to stop people, they're trying to give people a way out of these very strict gender norms that put them in danger and keep them pregnant and poor and keep development from happening and keep them from achieving their demographic dividend, which in half of sub-Saharan Africa, they're on the cusp of a demographic dividend where they could get really, really, successful, rich, wealthy, whatever, economically viable, at least in the next 20 years, if they are to do certain right things. But anyway, this idea that gender is a social construct, penetrative sex is not a social construct, but the idea of purity is a social construct. So I think they're trying to move people away from the idea that sex is inherently an ethical question, because, and it's very, very complicated, and I'm maybe covering too many topics right here, but I see how the comprehensive sexuality education, it's part of the same thing. They saw a long time ago that, we have to use comprehensive sexuality education to teach people that these gender norms are harmful and they're bad, but also to say to them, sex is good and pleasurable, and talk to kids about sex early and often. This is a Dutch model, and it's been incorporated by UNESCO, who created the technical guidance in 2018, and it's landing in your kids' schools right now. So my kid is going to next year. I don't know if you've seen the Evras. I don't know what it's called in Flanders, but in the French-speaking part, it's called Evras. It's wild. It's wild. The sexting for 9-year-olds, sending nude.
Well, I really object, and I'm trying to raise awareness about this this gender identity ideology being taught at all in schools. I think that parents should be first made aware of what exactly is being taught.
Yeah.
I think most of it is done behind the parents' back, and purposefully so. So I think that is that tells us something. And secondly, I think that parents should have the right to opt out of it. The children are not the property of the state. I think parents are responsible for the education of their children and should be allowed their say in what is being taught to them, especially this ideological driven, non-scientific, quasi-religious identity nonsense, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm really, really, really vehemently against the teaching and the fact that these activist groups and NGOs are allowed into schools. I think schools are made for education. They're not there to brainwash or for some kind of social engineering, which is what's happening.
It is.
So, yeah, but I think the realization is slow, but I'm also hopeful, because what I've seen in the US is that woke ideology has really moved on quite a bit until they reached the schools, until they reached the children. And then what you saw, I think, is that a lot of the school boards, the parents started objecting, and that was the beginning of the pushback. And now you see people like Ron DeSantis and others, and I think Vivek Ramaswamy, a very bright and intelligent man, US presidential candidate, is making it, let's say, a focus in his presidential campaign to roll back all this insanity. So I think we're not in the same place anymore as we were 3 years ago, 5 years ago. There is pushback, but it's promising to be a long fight. Now, on this topic, I was wondering, how do you explain the fact that women are fighting back? I'm thinking about, brave and courageous people like Posey Parker, who advocates for sex-based rights and who is waging this fight with great, let's say, risk to her person and her physical safety. But how come that the gay movement has been so slow to realize that this gender identity ideology, especially this transgender ideology, is really equally harmful for them? But I'm just very surprised that there hasn't been a split yet between the gay movement and the trans and the queer.
Well, in the UK, there's the LGB Alliance. I mean, also they're in Germany, they're in Australia, they're in the US. But yeah, I think I wish, if only it wasn't such a taboo subject, because anthropologically, for sociologists, it would be one of the most amazing things to explore. And my only hope is that in years to come, people will examine this period and say, what the fuck was going on, and how did people And I think we'll have different profiles, and I can imagine, there'll be different profiles of different characters, of who resisted, who didn't resist, why they didn't. It's so interesting because I think the thing about gay men, particularly, not gay women as such, but gay men, I've gotten in trouble for saying this before, but there's nobody on this planet who has less to do with women than a gay man. He has his mother and his sister and his cousins maybe, but he doesn't live with a woman, and he isn't a woman. And so they might remember their own struggles or remember stories of struggles in previous generations and say, oh yeah, that sounds similar. That's what I need to fight for. And it might be just ignorance. And to be honest with you, so many women are on board with this as well, that this is a question that occupies me a lot.
It's amazing.
It's
It continues to baffle me how, as a woman, you can, for example, in Belgium, the dean of one of our most famous business schools puts she, her in her bio, which is like advertising the fact that she's woke. This whole ideology goes against women and female rights. It's actually setting them back 60 years, in my view. So I find this completely baffling. I don't understand.
I think the key thing that you said there was dean of a business school. No poor women are involved in this. And so I've been thinking, I don't have any time because all I do is turf and work and look after my kids. But if I had time and money, I often think to myself, if J.K. Rowling were to come and say to me, here's 250K, what would I do with it? What would be the most important thing? And sometimes I think it would be taking a mic and going into housing estates, poor neighborhoods, and saying to women, do you know they were raising biological sex from law? And what do you think about that? And just put it all together and just blast it on Twitter. So if anybody out there who's rich, to show the thing is about this, the women who make the laws have never even met the women they make the laws for. I have worked in European institutions, I have worked in corporations, and I've also grown up dirt poor in a housing estate. And I grew up thinking that everybody grew up like me. And then I got into, the fancy rarefied places, and nobody knew my background, and they all thought I was one of them. And I went on happily like this for years until one day it took me about a decade to realize, they don't know who they're making. They don't know the people they're making these policies for. You don't have choices when you're poor. You can't, if your local women's sauna starts allowing men with erections to come into your sauna, you can't just go to another sauna because you don't have a car, or you can't, or that's where all your friends go, or because you have a subscription, an abonnement, and you have it until the end of the year. You don't have choices when you have no money.
It's a different world if you're the dean of a business school or some high-profile lawyer or not a laptop class member, where you want to have equal access to traditionally male professions. But it's a totally different ballgame if you're lower on the social scale and you're confronted with all the downsides of this of this insane ideology.
Maybe if people aren't familiar with Mary Harrington's theory about these laptop class women, about the idea that it might jeopardize their position to reveal that men and women are in fact in some ways different. They need to maintain this illusion that there is no difference between men and women in order to maintain their spot, because they wouldn't like to be, to be questioned. Maybe, do you deserve to be here? If you've got a woman brain, because that's not what we're saying.
What type of feminism is it that you adhere to?
I don't ever remember calling myself a feminist, quite honestly, except maybe when I was 13, because it's assumed that you're a feminist, and you assume that you're a feminist because you're a right-thinking person. But there was a time around 2015, 2016, where I just said, I don't have anything to do with this word. It's like left and right. I don't know what it means anymore. Feminists.
Yes, I have a hard time figuring out what it means too. That's why I'm asking the question.
And that's why, Mary Harrington's theory is really good. Let me get on to that in a minute. I love thinking about it, even if I don't know if I agree with it or not. I don't know how I feel about a million things.
That's why we're having this conversation. I think it's fantastic.
The thing about, when you look at right now what feminists who are, feminists, TM, copyright symbol, what they are for, it's for surrogacy, which is renting the wombs of poor women, which is basically a type of human trafficking, or will become a type of human trafficking.
That's
It's
radical individualism, rather radical. That's what Mary calls the feminism of freedom, the cyborg feminism. Yeah.
and then bodily autonomy, which in a horrible like sleight of hand, they've put gender affirming care in with abortion now, so that to be against one is to be against both. So they, you can't even, all of the things that they're for, pro prostitution, the decriminalization, the complete deregularization of prostitution, all of these are philanthropist, billionaire, horny men's dreams. Like, they have nothing to do with women. And
I think it's larger than that. Mary Harrington and Paul call it is, they say the project of modernity is to build a machine to replace God, because we've given up on God, and consequently we've given up on limits and living within the natural world. And I think that is a very, very well formulated assessment, which is a bit wider than the
it is.
gender identity ideology. It's talking about the fact that progressives have really abolished all the norms that made society function until now, and that have we are a product of this evolution for thousands of years. And all of a sudden, things that we adhered to 50 years ago, even 5 months ago, everything goes out the window. And like I said, it's only the power of money that remains.
In this world of turfing, there are a few meta themes, meta explanations. Transhumanism is one, capitalism is another, patriarchy is another. I don't ever have any grand ideas. I just want PDFs with the bit where they were in a meeting and they say, so that's why I listen to all these theories and I say they're all right. Everybody's got really good theories, but I'm really constant. The reason why I never go there, I never get that far, is I just want to know who signed off on this, and then maybe we'll figure out their motivations later, because there's so many people involved and so many institutions involved,
Yeah,
that if we say, for
I hear
example,
you.
humanism, it is transhumanism, it is
It is, yeah.
is all of these things, but I need to know who set up the conference where the white paper was drafted, where they said, okay, we are, because if it turns out to be one very rich autogynephile in the US who instituted them, it could be Martin Rothblatt who paid for all of this. It could be the Open Society Foundations who orchestrated all this. I need to find the bit of paper.
Well, I think the answer to this is we don't have ideas. Ideas have us. And I think it's an evolution. It's not some grand plot where you have 6 evil men in a basement plotting all this.
There has to be one smoking gun document, because
No. You don't need a conspiracy in which there are 6 evil people in a bunker making a sinister plan. You just need enough people to buy into something which is moving already.
yeah.
It's the inevitable result of the world view of modernity. The notion of the rational individual who can detach himself from nature and build his own paradise now. We've got the technology to do it. So that's where all this is coming from. It's sort of the fact of us interacting with technology making certain things possible, and always taking it's I don't believe in a conspiracy theory, but I do think that it's tremendously important to hear people like Paul Kingsnorth and Mary and others who reflect on these issues, because it will help us in the fight against this nonsense. And I think part of the answer might be going back to things that used to work not such long time ago. I think we chucked out a lot of the norms and systems that actually made our society work and that made people happy. I think a lot of what we've been doing in the past few decades is moving us away from this happiness towards the state that we're in now, which is, I mean, there's an epidemic of loneliness, and there's an epidemic of mental health, as far as I can see when you start reading on this subject, and these things are only getting worse.
There were so many aspects to this, and I have huge frustration with trying to understand the steps that were involved.
I think part of the answer will be in there, understanding where it's coming from, understanding that there is no giant plot, but also understanding who are the people that we need to support in this fight, and very importantly, who are the people that we need to vote for, because the old fault lines in politics between left and right, between conservative, progressive, to me they're totally irrelevant. I'm voting for the humanists in next time I get a chance, and I'm definitely voting against all of this nonsense, because this is not what's going to advance any of us. It's not going to protect my children. It's not going to make my children happy. I'm actually extremely worried about the material that they are taught in schools.
What old are your kids?
Well, my children, I'm at the age where I'm hoping for grandchildren. But I think that the way that society is evolving, I think everything can be better. I'm not saying that the way things were, that it was perfect. Everything is always, there's always room for improvement. But I think that we just chucked out too many systems and norms and values that actually made us happier.
The point about the family that I just wanted to come back to is that I noticed that a lot of the people who want to chuck out the norms of the family are people who grew up in wonderful families themselves, and a lot of this is just, I grew up in a single parent household with no dad. I never met my dad, but he brutalized my mother before he left her. I grew up in abject poverty. And now I'm as alternative and peace and love as anyone, but I can see that my kids having their dads here is a very good thing for them. I have a son who needs, and this is just, Nazi, like, in some circles.
You should follow Roisin. You should follow Rob Henderson. He actually did great research on this topic. Rob Henderson is a guy who came from dirt poor background and who worked himself up as one of the, let's say, famous and leading academics in the US. And he did a lot of research of how is this possible that people are advocating this kind of woke policies, which he couldn't understand exactly because of the background that he came from, but they're just simply never confronted with the downside. So that's why it is. Rob Henderson was on Chris Williamson on Modern Living. I really recommend you to go there and listen to it.
He maybe like me, it took him half his life to realize, like, oh, they don't know. They actually don't know, and they think they know. And
they really believe in this stuff, but they don't know. They're not aware of any of the negative consequences.
We need to bring them on a bus tour. We need to bring them on a bus tour of the vast majority of the country and just say, look, don't deprive these people of the stability and of the safety that you took advantage of your entire life.
Do you know something that you're probably going to object to, but that's why I'm actually in favor of. We used to have army service in Belgium, compulsory. And, I'm from a middle-class background, so not poor. My father worked, my mother was at home. We were 4 at home. And naturally, they picked my school. And then they picked, together we picked university. And you don't realize it, but you grow up in this protected social environment. And you think that's what the world is like. And for me, to be very honest with you, the first time that I was confronted with what reality actually is and how society really works was when I was when I came to the army. That's when you get the social mix. That's when you get this first experience with people that you haven't chosen and that you have to work with. You have to work with this platoon, which is full of people who have a completely different education, completely different background, and who just say fuck you if they don't respect you. So in that sense, I think it's really a big loss that we don't have this anymore. And that's one of the institutions that I think you have to be careful when you throw away things which have existed for such a long time in the past, because maybe you don't understand all the functions that they have and all the positive things that you're throwing away.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm as I said earlier, I'm super peace and love. Like, I'm very much about not doing things in a traditional way, but there are some things, and I wonder, where, is it just being a mother that has made me see that there are some things that you don't fuck with? You need to keep some borders in place. I don't know why it's so strong in me, but I was just a normal person living a normal life a couple of years ago, and this has triggered me. No, like I wake up at 3 in the morning and I start, on my phone, I'm reading PDFs from 1976 about meetings with, the transsexual organization of Norway. Like, I'm obsessed with this idea that somebody has decided that sex is not real and that we'll deal with the repercussions when we get to them. My answer is no. I think that there are many, and this is a very important thing as well. You talked earlier about elections and voting. We can't talk to each other about it because it's too sensitive and everybody whispers if you bring it up. But voting is secret. And we see that in Spain now. The Spanish feminists have instituted some of the most misogynistic, woke, trans-friendly laws.
Yeah.
And they are now coalitions of the far right. And I mean, I would be voting for those parties too at this.
Yeah, exactly. I think far right is also a term that is thrown around.
The misnomer.
Maybe it's better these days to talk. I mean, in Belgium we have Vlaams Belang, which I used to see as well. To be honest, 30 years ago I saw them as far right, but like everything has moved to the left, and what we used to call far right, to me these days, most of them, I call them the populist right, and they are people who are actually grounded in reality, who are rooted in these values. And the second that you start talking about values, you're treated as a fascist by the radical left. So I mean, the ease with which they are throwing the F word around is really, really incredible. And it only has one function: to shut you up and shut up and to end the debate.
Let them, and soon they will call every F word, and then there'll be no.
Exactly.
Let's wipe the slate clean of those people because they've lost. They're lost.
Well, Roisin, it's been a real joy having you on. I think this is an excellent note to end the conversation. I think we probably could go on for another hour at least. So maybe we'll meet again in the future and discuss some of the other aspects. I hope this was interesting for the people who are watching us. And I look forward to having you on again at some time in the future.
I would love to. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Roisin. Thanks very much.